I'm meant to be talking, am I? Your age and my age, it's the latter.
Okay, good afternoon, almost good evening to people in San Francisco and people on the call with us. Longtime listener, first time caller, I'm Chris. To my left is Russ and to my right is KR. We are in the SIDROPS meeting in San Francisco at IETF 117. If you are not at IETF 117, then well, welcome here anyway. If you think you're not supposed to be in SIDROPS, you should probably leave the room or stay. It could be fun. Here's the note well. I'm sure everyone's read it. You can't read it on the screen because it's intentionally very small. Thank you. We have a relatively tight agenda, so the people, oh, oops, sorry, I misspelled Jeff's name, apparently.
Yeah, you did.
I did. Awesome. Okay, perfect. I'm very sorry. Up to the front, Clemens. Okay, there is a question for in the agenda bashing that came up. I think Job wanted to have us talk quickly about requiring implementations before we take a draft off that has some software implications off to the IESG. I think we talked about this in the past, maybe 2 years ago. I think we sort of said, this sounds like an idea that would be good. And then we didn't really do anything about that. It would be good if maybe we thought about this again. We could talk about it on the mailing list. I'll start a mail while we're having the rest of our conversation here. But I think we've certainly found cases where we deployed software for the purpose of SIDROPS and gotten ourselves in trouble with not having interoperable software stacks. So I'll put all this in an email, and maybe at the end of that, we'll have some reasonable, I don't know which one's on.
We've also had trouble where people have deployed code on early internet drafts, and then the RFCs come along and they don't interoperate. So some way of dealing with these issues, or at least identifying them, would be helpful.
And I'd say, this has worked very well in IDR based on what we have done in IDR. So it's generally a good practice to enforce it with a single implementation minimally. Jeff doesn't like it.
Jeff's, yep.
Really quick comment about that. I actually find this troublesome and difficult because of where Russ said the issue of investing time, effort, and resources into this area without knowing where the target is going to be and whether your work is actually all for nothing or not. I also find that once you get a draft and you've got implementations, there's an extraordinary back pressure against change. And my first idea is always my worst, right? And if someone's gone, oh, I've written it all up, and it's kind of, well, poor you, that was really a bad idea. So I'm a little bit more, it shouldn't be a strict prerequisite. Now, at some point down the line where you're willing to say this draft, this idea, this framework is now mature enough that the changes aren't going to be substantive, you've got a much better chance of actually writing some code and seeing it through. But at the early time, oh, geez, it's a lot of effort and it's a big punt, and I'm not sure people are that rich these days in people and resources and money to chase every last thing. So,
Just really quickly before we get too deep in the line, we have 6 presentations. We have 60 minutes. So I'm going to write something during the presentations, and it doesn't mean I'm not paying attention to Jeff, but, and we can discuss this, I think, on the list, I think would be the best place. I just wanted to make sure to bring the topic up. Jeff's slides are about RP. I have no idea. Oh, prefix list. It's something about prefix lists. Yeah, they're Well, hopefully you sent them.
It's actually a really simple draft. So I'll talk about it and hopefully some slides will come up. A rower is a one-way authority without any handshake. So I happen to have control, I'm the current holder of a prefix, and I can allow AS1, AS2, AS3, blah, blah, blah. Anyone I want. That doesn't mean they've agreed. But if that appears for some reason, God knows why, that AS hasn't necessarily been part of the appearance of that particular route because there's no handshake back. The AS holder hasn't agreed. Now, if you look back at where the IRR was and the areas about what we put in that route registry, there was one thing that supposedly was authored by the originating AS. You're really doing well on that slide pack, aren't you? Oh, you did. I sent them an email to you. So this is a signed object signed by the holder of the AS. And it enumerates all of the prefixes that you intend to announce. It's kind of saying, if you see this, it's not a leak, it's not an accident, this could happen. There are reasons why I'm doing this. If there's both a rower and the prefixes on that list, you've actually got the handshake you're after. Because at that point, there is an implicit authority and an intent to route. So this is nothing different to the original IRR model of, was it a route set? Does anyone remember?
No.
Someone
It
remembers.
it was the route object, and the route object actually had countersigned from the address space and the AS.
Well, signing and the IRR was always an interesting concept, but let's just leave it there.
Yes.
Yes,
Yeah,
waving
but
hands.
kind of the set objects never had any valid kind of
So
signature.
the route object is then signed by the AS holder. If you're seeing something that I'm originating that's not in that set, you shouldn't believe it and you shouldn't accept it. I didn't say I was ever going to do that. If you see something that is on that set, but there's no rower, you shouldn't accept it. There's no rower. If there was a rower for other ASs, but not mine, and I've said I'm going to announce it, it's an invalid case of announcement, throw it out. If they both exist, you need the handshake to make it valid. Slides explain this in detail. You're looking quizzical, Warren. I'm still extemporizing here. We'll just have to take it on the fly. Yeah, without the slides. I'm going to answer. It's all explained in the slides, by the way.
So Warren Kumari with no hats. So I'm a little confused. If I say that AS42 can announce a prefix, if it's
Your
not
prefix.
yeah, my prefix, isn't the other part of the handshake when AS42 actually decides to announce the prefix? And if they don't announce the prefix, what does it matter if I've said that they can do it? Right? Like, what's the actual problem that this is solving other than like, I can say AS42 can announce it and they can just ignore that?
I feel like we're backtracking.
Yeah, there's a line. Probably I did something.
Yeah, you did. Rudiger, you can answer him. I can answer him,
Yes.
but I'll leave it to you.
Warren, kind of what the proposal actually delivers is that in absence of BGP-SEC, the signed AS signed route information protects against a different AS announcing the stuff. And well, okay, huh? It's not really worth working on it.
I mean, if I don't want AS42 to be able to announce it, I don't list AS42 in the rower. And if I do, then they
Go
can.
back a couple of slides while they're having a
Okay. Hopefully Jeff's thing. Oh, look, my name is still up on the list because the person in the queue.
Back. Do one more. Yeah. It's the equivalent of a route set. It's what you may announce. And it was an old idea to say, write down everything you intend to do. If you're doing something else, you may well have had a whoopsie. You've got some kind of leak going on. You didn't intend to do it. There is no reason why it should be there in the routing system. Anyone can take it away because you didn't give permission as the AS holder. So that's the basic proposal. I think you've gone through in that discussion at the microphone most of the other points. If there are any other clarifying questions, I'll happily try and answer them or give it back to the cabal at the microphone again. They can reconvene.
Thanks, Ben Workenman. I tend to agree with Warren that this is not a helpful way of solving that problem. Like I think we can find a better way of solving the AS impersonation problem, which is kind of what Rudiger was talking about. But I do still think that this is helpful. And and the reason that I think this is helpful is not because I don't think that handshake is actually necessary. What we do need undoubtedly is a way of verifying that someone purporting to be a BGP speaker with a particular AS is in fact the holder of that AS. But I think this is not quite the right way of solving that problem.
The RPKI says you're the holder of the AS, otherwise you couldn't sign it. So it's not the AS itself that's the issue. The issue is really one of, I see a route out there with you as the originator. Is this a leak? Is this synthetic? Is this real? Right?
Yeah.
Now, in the golden world where everything has rowers, it's not a problem. You will be dead before that happens, and so will I. So until then, the way the AS holder can kind of say, look, if you want to audit what I'm doing, please do. Here's the list of everything that you might see from me. If what you see is not in that list, feel free to discard it because I didn't intend to do this.
Yep.
That's all it's saying. Belts and braces, there may be optimal solutions down there further down the track, Ben. Fine. This seemed a simple port of a route object, thank you, Rudiger, into this world that is an exact one-to-one replica.
Yep.
That's all it is.
So I don't disagree with any of that. And I think that this is useful partly because of the way that operationally today, what we have is we've got kind of a bunch of static filters to deal with bogons and stuff like that. We've got a bunch of IRR-based filters that are kind of a worst case scenario with a lot of garbage in them, which act as a backstop. And then we have origin validation, which is much more fine-grained, but can go away in the face of operational problems. And we need all of those things. If we're going to get to a place where we no longer need the IRR-based component of that, then we need to replace it with something. And this is a good candidate for that.
So this replaces the route object
Yes,
with
exactly.
a signature, validity dates, and a clear author who is the AS holder. I can't just make random ASCII nonsense and drop it in a registry.
Yep.
All of those things are improvement to a venerable model that has been used by many communities in the past. So it's not doing damage. Keep it up to date. There are got dates anyway. If you don't, it's going to lapse. And that's a good thing. Old information is bad. And it just seems this is just a small brick in that area that is not harmful. It's actually a positive movement.
So I think the thing that we need in order to kind of complete that, the replacement of those properties that we get from the IRR today is, and we were kind of talking about this offline, is we need the thing that the IRR has going for it, which is the other side of the problems that result in all of the stale data, is that the data in there is really stable, much more so than the RPKI is today. The RPKI information goes away in a transient fashion all the time because of operational problems. What we need is a stable backstop to indicate the worst case scenario, the kind of the widest possible set of things that could be validly announced by an AS number, and that's what resolving root sets and AS sets gives us today. I think that we need, in order for this to fill that gap, we need to think about what the relying party model should be in the face of these objects expiring and not going away in a surprising fashion. I think we need some way of making them kind of fail closed in a safe way, in a way that doesn't switch off the internet if there's breakage in the RPKI system.
I feel you've kind of taken stuff.
Hold on, Jeff. I need to cut the line because we have a whole bunch more meaning you guys stay, no one else joins. But let's keep the questions short and the responses short too. Thank you.
I think you've got the answer. I'll go.
Job Snyders, Fastly. It is my personal desire to help move this community away from plain text, unsigned ASCII garbage into RPKI-based solutions. And I think that this draft represents a positive step in that direction. To answer Ben first, the relying party will, of course, just follow the signed object template validation procedures. What the operator does with the validated output, so for instance, cache it over a number of cycles, that's up to the operator. And to answer Rüdiger, that he says it's not worth it. This spec is so simple to implement for signers, relying parties, and BGP implementations that it seems like a worthwhile exercise to run this through and see how it benefits us, especially because we can now cover prefixes that are not covered by ROAS. So there's multiple angles, I think, positive benefits to this approach.
Thank you, co-author.
This is the copyright NCC. I get that the IRR can do that, and this is a feature gap there. But where I have trouble understanding it is what threats we're mitigating with this approach and how this all fits together. Because we are adding a cost to the ecosystem because the data the feature is only valuable when the data is actually there, correct, not expired, and it's kind of complete. So at any addition, I want to know what threat we're mitigating by adding it, and if it's the right solution.
It takes the place of unsigned, unverified, anonymous data that sits inside the route registries we run today in that particular area. And surely that is better than what we're currently doing. That's all. There are a myriad of other problems out there. Feel free to solve them all. This one has a very small target, and that's exactly what it's intended to do. Just that.
Okay, thanks for the explanation of the threat it mitigates, I guess.
Sriram, NIST. Geoff, you should take a look at, just Google AS hijack SIDROPS. So we wrote a draft maybe 4 or 5 years ago, which is exactly the same thing. So I'm glad that
this is not an invention. This is the old route registry route object.
Yeah,
Nothing has been invented other than it's got a signature at the bottom.
Right. No problem. I'm happy that you are corroborating what we thought about and wrote it.
Rüdiger.
Wrote it in a draft several years ago. We called it REAP, R-E-A-P. ROAS exist for all my prefixes. So we proposed that object. It's signed by the AS, and basically this is what it says. So please take a look at that, and we can certainly.
Well, if you find that there's more text that needs to go in this, can we go to the last slide, please? Because we're going to throw this, cut this to an end. No, further. Yes, there we go. If you choose to adopt it, you feel free to have a hack at this and find out what's missing from your perspective. There's not much in it. You could probably read it in less time than it took to get through this presentation. It's very simple.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next up is Sriram, please.
And we are 5 minutes behind the schedule, so please go as fast as possible.
We have a pointer here. Good evening. I'm Sriram from NIST. So this talk is about the ASPA draft update. Both the ASPA verification draft and the profile drafts were updated this month. The FE limit has been removed, so that that causes some ripple effects in the verification draft. So the verification, next slide, please. Verification draft has been updated to conform to the removal of the FE limit. So that's good. Section 7, 8, and 8 have been better organized. We've added a new section, verification and mitigation at egress eBGP routers. Thinking about it again, and I had a discussion with Job yesterday, it doesn't seem like a good idea. So we are going to remove that slide, sorry, that section. Then DDoS mitigation service provider, it's a simple operational recommendation that helps DDoS mitigation service. Next slide, please. So one question that has come up is regarding, like, so far the verification draft only includes eBGP ingress AS path verification using ASPA. Do we want to have something corresponding to RFC 8893, Rudiger and Randy Bush's, to do egress, EGP egress AS path verification? It's not as simple as it is for ROV. It gets complicated. We also have a question about whether AS path verification should be done in IBGP as well. So IBGP seems doable, and without requiring any algorithm changes. One simple thing that would be done is to look up the AS2's own ROA at R2, R2 being the egress router. When it receives routes in IBGP, it looks up AS2's own ASPA and uses the same upstream, downstream algorithms for AS path verification, and that works fine. But with eBGP, it's not possible to do it correctly without much more complexity. It does not seem like a good idea. Instead, if we simply focus on using the OTC attribute RFC 9234, that would do a great deal for preventing local route leaks. That is what egress eBGP verification accomplishes. Next slide, please. So we are, I mean, I put together some slides. Authors will hopefully get together and discuss it this week. Keyur, Yob, Ben, whoever is available, we can have a little conversation about that. I'll just go through the next three slides in 30 seconds and I'll be done. Next slide. These are backup slides, so that's why I'm not going to go into detail. Just want to mention that I've made the slides. The material is there that will help this discussion. So details of verification in IBGP, that's doable, and it can be possibly included in the draft with very little effort. Next slide, please. Verification at eBGP egress. So Job and I discussed, we didn't think it was a good idea, gets into some complex things. Again, the details of how that you might approach that, but what are the drawbacks, how it fails, how it evaluates a unknown as an invalid as an unknown. That's not a good thing. And then if you complicate it further, then only maybe you can get it right and it's not worth it. But instead, if you simply do RFC 9234, which is the only to the customer attribute to detect whether you are, your AS is causing a leak locally, and you can prevent that. And that combined with ingress, with IBGP verification, does it all for us on the ingress router. So next slide, I think, yeah, I have a few possible recommendations. So we'll see how the discussion goes in the author group, and then we will take it out to the email list as well, and we can resolve it easily and quickly. Thank you. Any
questions?
Oliver, he has to either Rob Taylor or Jason Tishman. Oliver, please.
Okay. Doesn't matter which one you start with. Okay, so this is it's basically two drafts, and they're both pretty much the same. One deals with ASPA, validated ASPA objects, the other one with validated raw objects. And the intent from that came in IETF112. We created, or we had a hackathon where we were creating ASPA data sets and so forth. And the idea was to have a certain data set and certain result set. And then when you want to test your application, your implementation, you can basically get your result set and compare to what we gave. Now, yes, there are JSON models of all this stuff, but they're not really human readable. They're very complex, cluttered, if you only are interested in the validated output. And that's why we came up and said, okay, let's create a BNF notation where you can display the validated objects, and that can make it very easy to compare result outcomes. We have some tools where we basically log things, or where we also script certain things that can be used for that. And maybe one thing what I forgot to say, that is only informational. So it's not a standards draft, it's an informational draft. Can be used, does not have to be used. It's also very good for documentation. Next slide. So that would be, for example, the ASPA notation, and there you see basically the examples how it could look like. And then the second draft is pretty much the same, just for raw objects. They can go directly to slide number 3. So that would be for the raw object or the validated raw information. That's it. Questions? Oh, so yeah, and we would like to make working group adoption call for that. But I also will send an email to make it. Yes.
Jeff, I was at the risk of putting people to sleep. So the important stuff, is it your intent that this shows up in this format as a string in Yang modules that will be for ASPA, or is it your intent that you actually unpack this stuff into a structure of leaves for this in Yang? Or have you not thought about Yang yet?
I did not think about Yang yet, no.
Okay.
But we can talk about that. That's, I mean, yeah.
You don't know. I'll offer comments offline.
The thing is, we want to make it simple. That's why we also say informational, and it's not something what people have to implement, people have to use. It's just for the small group of people who basically have implementations, that we have something where we can create something where we easily can compare outcomes and so forth.
Right. One of the things that you're going to probably also want to talk about is sorting for the list, just simply because one of the things you're going to end up doing is you got people that are, despite the fact that this is structured data, they're going to want to run grep on it.
Yeah. Rüdiger.
Okay.
Rudiger, the queue is locked. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. Would you keep it?
Well, okay. The syntax does not look very Baroque, but looking at how simple it is, I think, well, okay, the sorting thing from sorting sequence, I think, is actually very important. And for the syntax, actually a CSV would do.
Yes, but you still have to basically give rules for the syntax.
Yes, define a standard.
Yeah, that's basically it. And I think actually, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we have sorting in there. Is it draft? And if not, then we can easily add it too. I agree with you. Yeah. Yeah, makes sense. Okay.
Thank you, Oliver.
You're welcome.
Okay, microphone is working, and I'm breaking it, aren't I? This should be short and sweet. Next slide, please. Yeah, me and co-authors are working on the documenting the best practices for running a publication server and rsync and RDP repositories, because this is both simple but also complicated. Next slide, please. Yeah, the basis is simple, but the details where it goes wrong are complicated. There's a lot of lessons learned, and we want to write those down before other people learn these lessons through debugging. That's the goal. The scope is how you run a publication server, rsync RDP repositories, how these repositories interact with the chosen deployment platform, fun stuff about load balancers, CDNs, negative caching, fun things to debug, and how these choices relate to relying party behavior. Next slide, please. We've written down the first version of the draft, and potentially there's a very large scope, so really trying to keep it limited. And we are discussing some quite, they seem arcane operational and deployment choices that are part here, because these are painful lessons learned. And these are small issues in the long tail, but potentially with a big impact if they happen to you. Next slide, please. So all of you, please read this document. Really welcome to work with you on the content and expand it where needed. I think writing this and people applying this will make for more reliable repositories. And yeah, I would really like working group adoption for this document. That's it. Please send email. Will do.
Thank you. And you get full 15 minutes now.
All right. CMS signing time. Next slide, please. Oh, I'm Job Snyders. I work for Fastly. Thanks for having me here. Today I want to talk about a mechanism to improve the efficiency of failing over from RDP to rsync. In the last few years, we've seen a number of, let's call them RRDP outages that are, for instance, the result of somehow malformed XML slipping into the notification file or snapshots, duplication of publish elements, or TLS errors where the publication point operator somehow forgot to renew their Let's Encrypt certificate. There's a myriad of reasons why RDP might fail. And that's okay, because the working group arrived to some informal consensus that if RDP doesn't work, only then we'll try rsync. And optimizing the switch from fetching via RDP to fetching via rsync, I believe there's some implementation tricks that would help reduce the computational and bandwidth cost on both client and publication points. Next slide, please. How rsync works. When the rsync client connects to the rsync server, by default, the mechanism to figure out if a file should be transferred is to compare the last modification timestamp of the file on the client side with the last modification timestamp on the server side, and additionally compare the file size. And those two primitives are super easy to check. You don't need to read the whole file. You only need to read the metadata of the file. So this makes for incredible speed. Next slide, please. Now, let's talk about a naive RDP implementation. Most relying party implementations use a POSIX-style file system as their backend, either for the so-called staging directories in which they unpack data that has not yet been validated, or for their so-called validated local cache, which is a set of data that the relying party considers valid and usable for further dissemination in the pipeline. Now, speaking for just RPKI clients, what we originally did was we'd slurp in the XML over the TLS connection, decode the base 64, write the dir encoded bytes to disk, run a cryptographic validation process, and if that was successful, then move the files into from its temporary location into its final location. But in doing so, the creation of that file on the file system had the timestamp now, basically the moment the RP started writing to the file system. Next slide, please. And the consequence of this is that the moment RDP fails for one reason or another, you cannot recycle those files when you initiate the rsync transfer because the last modified timestamps for the objects retrieved via RDP is now, whereas what's visible on the rsync server is some point in the past. So here's an example of the Fort validator running against the right trust anchor. It stores the files in /temp/fort/repository. You can see that the creation date of the MFT, CRL, and ROAS is very close to the date at which I launched this process. Fort takes like 1 or 2 minutes to do this job. But if you then inspect the rsync server itself that hosts a copy of these files, you see that the last modification dates are very different. Next slide, please. So recently in RPKI client, we implemented the following trick. When objects are retrieved through RDP, after validating and parsing the file, so before we can extract timestamps that are internal in the RPKI file, we must of course confirm that it's a parsable file. So the moment we move the files from the staging directory into its final destination, the local validated cache, the last modification timestamp is updated in the case of CRLs to be this update, in the case of certificates, the not before timestamp, and in the case of signed objects, the CMS signing time is used. Now, should for some reason my TLS certificate on the RDP server expire, forcing me to try rsync, RPKI client calls the rsync utility with a command line option called compare dest. And this is a really cute feature because it allows you to point at a set of objects that you locally have, use that to figure out with the rsync server what the list of files is going to be to transfer, dump the new or different files into a temporary directory, and then you can run the validation process. Now, because the RDP originated files have so-called deterministic timestamps, the rsync transfer that relies on the last modification time and the file size is incredibly efficient, as efficient as it can be. And below is a link to the commit that accomplishes this, and you'll see that it's not a lot of lines. Next slide, please. So how efficient is this in reality? Many, but not all, certificate authorities immediately write to disk after signing an object. So you'll see this predominantly with RPKI.NET based CA implementations. And because of this property, coincidentally, a lot of the not before or CMS signing time or this update timestamp values internal to the RPKI object align with the last modified timestamp exposed at the file system level. Now, if publication point operators would start doing this purposefully, we'll see more and more benefit for RPs that are failing over from RDP to rsync. Next slide, please. What's also interesting to note is that at least in the libcrypto OpenSSL, LibreSSL implementation of CMS, by default, the CMS signing time is included in the signed attributes when the CMS product is created. Next slide, please. So this being the default in a number of cryptographic implementations, apparently has led to all signed objects that were discovered in the last 12 months. I plowed through tens of millions of them from the RPKI Views archive, carry the CMS signing time object attribute. So based on this data, it seems feasible to me to change the CMS signing time, the requirement for it to be present from a optional to a mandatory, because everybody today, all CAs under all trust anchors are already today adding the CMS signing time attribute. So increasing the requirement for this attribute would not put any CA in a state of non-compliance. Next slide, please. My recommendation is for relying parties that after you retrieve data through RRDP, after you parsed it, you can use the equivalent of utime and set, or whatever your Python or Rust or Java equivalent of that is, to align the file system's timestamp on the file system with the relevant internal RPKI timestamp. And then in addition to that, if you use rsync compare dest feature, you can repurpose your locally stored validated cache in order to have a head start when you sync against the rsync server. And for publication point operators, my recommendation is to ensure that the last modified timestamp of the files on your rsync server align with the file's internal RPKI timestamps. Next slide, please. Implementation status. RPKI client has support for this feature. That's on the relying party side. And on the publication side, I've wrote a tiny utility called RPKI Touch. If you pass the file names of the files where you would like to change the last modified timestamp in the file system metadata to the internal RPKI timestamps, you just pass the file names as argument to this utility, and it will change the timestamps. It's a very small utility, and you can include it in your existing deployments, or of course do this in the signer layer, but that's up to publication point operators. There's many ways to solve this, and RPKI Touch serves as an example implementation of what the expectation exactly is. And then, as I understand it, RIPE-NCC has a utility called rsync-it that converts RRDP to an rsync hierarchy that you can serve up. And they also deterministically set the timestamps following the procedure outlined in this draft. If I'm not mistaken, I did not test the software. Now, your feedback is most welcome. The draft is now a working group document, so I would love to hear from the working group, like, hey, can you clarify in a certain way how exactly to do this part of the trick, or why is that thing written down that particular way? Pull requests are welcome, but you can also just email me and I'll integrate your feedback. I think it's time for questions.
And for the obvious one, I think we both fully agree that async repositories need to have deterministic timestamps for objects. And the only question is about where to get the timestamp that you use. I think that right now we have a situation where for signing time, there are no restrictions on it cannot affect the validity of RPKI signed objects. And it appears to be present in all objects. The other timestamp you could use is the not before in the X509 certificate. I didn't write code for this to check if it's present in all EE certificates because if it's a certificate, it contains a not before time. However, of course, if a CA is reusing the same certificate for multiple signed objects, not following the new interpretation of manifests, the not before could be equal. So yeah, my question is, why not before?
I think both values
can be used because we agree indeed that having a deterministic timestamp is what makes this kind of trick work. But I personally like the CMS signing time a little bit better because if you view the signed objects as an onion with multiple layers, to extract the CMS signing time, it is literally less steps to extract that timestamp than to get to the EE certificates, not before. So on the publication point, it's a tiny, tiny optimization to use CMS signing time instead of the embedded X509 timestamp. I also think there is a subtle benefit to assigning a purpose to the CMS signing time attribute, because up until this day it is optional, but the IETF117 presentation by Randy Bush about timers in the RPKI ecosystem, that paper showed that there was a lot of value in being able to see a difference between the not before, which may be backdated because it does affect the validity window, and the CMS signing time, which is not backdated.
Does backdating matter for the timestamp being deterministic?
So ultimately, you need a deterministic timestamp that we all agree to. Which of the timestamps to pick is indeed a matter of almost intellectual debate. And this is why I'm advocating to give the CMS signing time a purpose, because it has in the past and probably in the future been of benefit to researchers to understand timing in the RPKI ecosystem. But technically, either value would work. Not after might also work. Like, yeah, there's a bunch of values we can choose from. And it is of critical importance that this working group comes to consensus on this is what we pick, because if we all pick something different, then we are not going to have any benefits doing this type of optimization.
Yeah. And they might even be equal. Yeah, my inclination is to marry combo the CMS signing time and completely give no meaning to it and still keep it arbitrary, no constraints there, because it feels simpler to me. I guess the underlying question is how many objects, how many CAs are out there that are not using single-use EE certificates. That's where there's a benefit to using CMS signing time. I'm fully agreeing with that.
Tease, I think that's exactly the right question, right? Because if they're using multiple certificate, the same certificate design multiple objects, right? Warren?
What Russ said might have just made my comment stupid, but to me, CMS signing time seems to sort of align with the sort of, you would sign a thing and you'd write it to a file, and the M time would largely be similar to that. So it seems like that lines up better with the sort of flow of data, how it normally would happen. So CMS signing time seems like a much more sane use, or much more sane timestamp.
Some implementations immediately write to disk, but other very large implementations store the file in a relational database and then produce RDP, and then from the RDP output produce the rsync. So it
just seems closer than not before, which is kind of like some date that I made up at some point. Wow, lots of people stand up.
Can I clarify first?
Sure.
From my perspective as a CA implementer, both signing time and not before, not after are just values the software picks. So they don't not necessarily have any connection to the point in time you make the object.
So I'm going to try and echo back to you the point that I think you were trying to make, and you can tell me if I'm right or not.
You're right.
I think what you were saying is that fundamentally, for the purposes of making the rsync transfer more efficient, it doesn't matter. You just need a timestamp that the publication side and the RP agree on. Yep. But the argument for using the CMS signing time rather than the not before is that if we're going to keep the signing time around, it's nice that it has a purpose so that it's clear what it's being held around for. And this is an opportunity to do that. So rather than having this slightly hand-wavy situation where it can be there or it doesn't have to be there, But if it is there, then it's helpful for debugging, but you can't actually rely on it ever. This is an opportunity to say it must be there, and it must be there for this specific operational reason. Yeah, in that case, I agree. I think that's the right choice.
Yeah, I knew it. You were right. Yeah. Thies offered some feedback a few weeks ago, arguing that publication point operators should not have a must set the timestamp. So we'll leave it up to the operators if they see benefit to doing it this way. That's up to them. So in the current version of the draft, it's a publication point operators should do this, and I think that that's okay. It's an optimization. It is not a necessity. All right, next.
4 minutes, please.
All right, next slide. The ASPA object profile specification has been updated to easily see the differences. I recommend using this beautiful short URL that is easy to punch into your phone. Next slide, please. In summary, the working group came to consensus that API agnostic ASPA objects are beneficial not only to signers, but also to relying parties and BGP implementations and network operators. And given that ASPA is not really yet deployed in the field, the only ASPA verification deployment that I'm aware of is my project in the Calgary Internet Exchange. So creating a situation where all currently deployed objects, save for 2 of them, are non-compliant was feasible. Next slide, please. With yellow and strike through, I highlighted the changes. Martin Hoffman was kind enough to point out that for the last few years we got it wrong and we're implicitly encoding the ASM1 tags. So this is a shame on the working group and myself for not noticing this issue, this very fundamental issue earlier on, but that's now been fixed. Another change is that the value of the putting some time pressure on me. Another change is that the value of the version field previously was 0, which means that from a DR encoding perspective, it would not be encoded on the wire because it's the default value. But going forward, the version field carries a value of 1, and that means it must be explicitly encoded. So keep that in mind. It's in the ASN1, it's in the natural language, and it's in the example ASPA object that is in the draft. So there's 3 places where you can now see that the version is 1. And then last but not least, the provider AS set is now a composition, a sequence of AS ID, which is an integer, and no longer is a sequence of provider AS, which was another sequence. Next slide, please. From an implementation perspective, in the last few weeks, we've made very, very good progress. On the relying party side, there is RPKI client and Routinator that are able to decode the version 16 objects. Both of those are not released or the feature being gated behind a compile option. So this is not for general consumption, but for demonstration purposes. On the signer side, if I'm not mistaken, the people from RIPE NCC, APNIC, have produced code that can encode the new version of the object. And then I have a private implementation myself to also produce new versions of the object. So there's a good interoperability matrix for this current version of the draft, which would tackle a barrier going through working group last call. Next slide, please. Last slide. Oh, yeah. The tricky one. So we have this notion of some networks being transit-free or tier 1 or transit-free in the sense of it being an IX route server. And there's a few ways we could express this in the objects. So there's not really right or wrong. So we can, really bike shed this one until cows come home. But we should think about whether this transit freeness should be expressed by using an integer of value 0 in the ASID, or use an empty sequence where providers simply are absent, and that indicates the transit freeness of the AS holder. I would love some feedback on this, unlist preferably. And I think once we answer this question, the profile should be ready to go to the next phase of review. Last slide, please. Yep, questions?
Was this Tisu who did this?
You gotta wear high heels, man. Will look good on you and be very practical.
I can talk and balance at the same time.
Ben, we've got one more presentation to go in 5 minutes.
I'm
Could
gonna
you
be really
keep it
quick.
short?
So just to add briefly to the question of how we express transit freeness, in addition to kind of the familiarity with how we do this for rowers, using the AS0 hack, the reason that we need, it's totally a hack. The reason that we needed to do it with Asper in the previous version of the profile is because we had the disjointness between the address families. And so we needed a thing to be able to attach an AFI limit to. We no longer have that now that we've dropped the AFI limit. And so I quite strongly feel that the cleaner way of doing this is to express transit freeness using an empty sequence. But we can bike shed that more outside.
All right, I see Rudiger in agreement. Ben, Warren is maybe. All right, yeah, we'll take it to the list.
Just a quick comment. You mentioned that you have the only ASPA implementation. I just want to inform you that the NIST BGP SRX implementation includes ASPA, at least since IETF112. So we have 2 implementation, even though we have to update ours with the AFI, and we're happy to do that.
My apologies.
Thank you,
I
Joop.
misspoke.
Joop, thank you.
2 sentences. I didn't mean software implementation. I meant deployment on real internet infrastructure. So yes, there's multiple software implementations, and there's one production deployment of ASPA verification. So
Joop, thank you.
Yep. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Hello, this is Yangfei Guo coming from Zhongguancun Laboratory. I will introduce briefly to you the receive RPK and IPsec based AS2S approach for source address validation. Next page, please. Thanks. Side-to-side IPsec is awesome. It defeats IP spoofing, improves security and privacy, and it is well understood and technically mature. It can be extremely fast. Any pairs of networks can use it. Next page, please. The typical setup protocol of IPsec is using internet key exchange to create a tunnel, and all traffic could send to and receive from peer with this tunnel. But if we can combine RPK and IPsec, this mechanism could play a more powerful role in the internet. Next page, please. Here shows the core idea of receive. First, define a config format equivalent Alice and Bob's emails as the last slide shows. Second, each participant publishes their config in the RPK database, including the content IP, as number, and IP range. Third, all participants sync the RPK database as 0. And last, each participant connects to all the other participants with their content IPs. There are so many details, technical details to be handled. But now let them run and just focus on receive itself. Next page, please. Okay, that is the overview of receive. It uses both RPK and IPsec. And it may add a MAC at source as a border router and delete and verify and delete it at destination as border router. If the packet carries the correct MAC, IP source address is viewed as correct. Next page, please. Okay. This is the changes to the IPsec. No need to stay in the SIDROPS, I think. Next page, please. Okay. Receive trace. This is the summary. Receive treats the internet as a true network networks. It provides, we think it provides clear benefits for participants. We think it is a matter one, and we are thinking working group adoption. Which one is the best working group? IPsec me or SIDROPS? Suggestions are welcomed. Thanks you all.
Any comments for him about this, whether it belongs in IPsec ME or in this group?
Job Snijders, Fastly. My gut feeling is that this belongs in an IPsec working group, but it would be useful if the document progresses further to ask SIDROPS for review of the ASN1 specification and any other comments. But given the nature of this type of work, I think it closer aligns with a source address validation combating group or IPsec group, not necessarily CIDR operations. But we can, of course, review the document at some later stage.
If there's anyone who has the opposite view, please come to the mic.
Thanks.
Okay, then I guess we would like to see this progress, or if this progresses in IPsec ME or elsewhere, then we'd love to review it when it's beginning to get mature.
Thanks.
Okay. Thank you very much. That's the end of the agenda and past time. Thank you.